This is Theater Talk. I'm Susan Haskins. Our guest is one of the theater's most important directors, but he's written a memoir of his days as an aspiring actor, and we loved it so much that we have invited him back to talk about it. Here to introduce him, my co-host Michael Riedel of the New York Post.
It's always a great pleasure to have Michael Blakemore with us. He has directed Democracy, which is on Broadway. He won a Tony Award, of course, for Kiss Me, Kate a few seasons back, as well as Copenhagen. He has just come out in England with a terrific memoir about his early years in the theater, Arguments with England. Michael, welcome to Theater Talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
A really wonderful book, beautifully written, evocative of London in the days of the 50s when you were starting out. But I want to begin before that with the two people who got you going in the theater. Two people I guess you could say you sort of fell in love with, Laurence Olivier and Robert Morley. First Olivier, he was really the great actor who made the biggest impression on your life early.
Well, I think he did, yes. The two films, the two Shakespearean films he made, Henry V and Hamlet, both came to Australia. And of course we didn't have a lot of very good theatre in Australia, but we saw all the best films. And not long after, when Hamlet was playing, he came over with the Old Vic, with Vivien Leigh and the Old Vic Company, and did Richard III and School for Scandal and The Skin of Our Teeth, and we'd never seen anything like it. And I think a number of Australian aspiring actors jumped on boats and went straight over to England. And I reviewed, when he was playing at the Tivoli Theatre with the Old Vic Company, his film of Hamlet was showing. And I reviewed it for the university newspaper.
And what was your headline?
My headline was, "The Film's the Thing," which is pretty good.
Could get you a job at the Post, Mike.
Exactly. And to my astonishment, he wrote me back this charming letter, signed magically L. Olivier in blue ink at the bottom. And I just wanted to be part of that world.
Yeah. But your entry to that world was not through Olivier. It was through an actor, a wonderful actor, but I don't think he's as well known over here anymore as he once was, Robert Morley.
Yes, he's known for his movies.
Yes, he was a comic actor here, known here.
Yes, but his first great success, of course, was in drama. He was in a play which was banned in the 30s in England, Oscar Wilde, and he came to New York where it wasn't banned and had a huge success.
Right.
But he was touring Australia with a play that he'd written called Edward, My Son. And once again, my undoubted skills as a journalist got me into his dressing room. And I'd heard from his American assistant, the young Morton Gottlieb.
Yeah, well-known producer here.
Well-known producer here, who was then 27. That Robert was very displeased with the publicity he was getting from the Williamson organization. And with the innocence of 21 years, I just failed medicine. And my father was insisting I get a very unpleasant job to bring me to my senses. And I conceived this idea that I would blithely walk into Robert Morley's dressing room and say, "I hear the publicity is bad, will you give me a job? I've got a few ideas." And he would say yes. And fortunately I'd picked maybe the only major actor in the entire Western world who would actually entertain the idea. And I asked him for a job, and he said, "All right, I'll give you a job." And I said, "I'll work for nothing if you like." And he said, "My boy, never do anything for nothing. Ring me in the morning." So I rang him in the morning, and I got a job as his publicity.
Now, he said to you, this struck me if I just find it here, he was sort of asking you what you wanted to do in the theater. He said, "Do you want to be a publicist?" I guess a profession that he didn't think.
This was when I'd conspicuously failed at my first job. Then I got a job tutoring his children, which I was a little bit better at.
Right, right.
And then he was going to New Zealand, and he decided that the budget couldn't allow my continued employment.
He's asking you what you want to be in the theater. Publicist? No. Actor? Possibly. Then maybe the idea of a director. And he says, "Well, you'll have to develop a great deal more personality than you have at the moment if you want to be a director." I mean, what an amazing thing to say. How did you respond to that?
Well, he was always saying those kind of withering things, and they were half jokes.
But is there something true to that, though, as you were...
Well, in his presence, I mean, he was the most formidable person at the age of, what was I was about 20.
Yeah.
He was the most formidable person I'd ever met. He was so absolutely confident and articulate, and I suppose I did shrivel somewhat in his presence. But he was probably right.
Yeah.
He was probably right.
And then the book begins your journey to London, where you start to develop, not as a director, but as an actor. Your father was not very pleased with the decision to...
No, he was a surgeon. He was an eye surgeon,
Yeah.
and his plans were that I should follow him into the medical profession, and I didn't want to do that, so I failed all my exams.
Deliberately?
Well, I think probably deliberately, but also laziness and so forth. So I worked my passage to England on board a ship called the RMS Otranto, and Robert had written to the principal of RADA, and I got this position at RADA and embarked on a career as an actor. Because after the withering remark he made about my directing aspirations, he then said, well, I think you should be an actor. Actors can get away with anything. So he said,
did you even know what a director really was?
Oh yeah, I knew.
Yeah.
Well, like most Australians at that time, it was the movies that were our big influence.
Right.
Seeing things like Citizen Kane and The Maltese Falcon. These were the really seminal artistic events in my life. And I wasn't particularly interested in the theatre until the visit of the Old Vic. And I'd longed to be a film director. That's what I wanted to be. I think half of my generation all wanted to be film directors, you know. Orson Welles, whatever.
Your first audition, so to speak, though, was for Robert Morley, wasn't it? Didn't
it
you
was,
come
yes,
in one day and do a monologue?
Yes, he made me act a scene for him after the show one night and I found an actor in the company who was kind-hearted enough to read with me, and we did a scene from King Lear in which he played Gloucester and I played Edmund, the villainous part.
What a generous soul he was, to promote, to help you in that way. It's remarkable.
The actor?
Yes, but Morley.
Morley, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Oh,
Yeah.
yes. He was mischievous, you know. You jumped through the hoops for Robert.
Right.
He didn't like shyness. He thought shyness was a sort of form of vanity. And he liked people to be constantly on their toes.
Well, he liked your performance, your scene you did, because you didn't move around a lot, if I remember correctly.
That's right. He said, well, my boy, you made a very wise decision to remain stock still throughout the scene. I think the best idea is that you should go to RADA, and maybe after a two-year course, you may be able to attempt a move or two.
And then didn't he get you into RADA?
He didn't get me in. No, he wrote on
for
my
you.
behalf to the principal. Then I had to audition, which I did,
Yes.
and to my astonishment got in because I was very bad.
Give us the sense of what the school and the time was like. I mean, you have no money, but you're doing many different plays for these extraordinarily colorful teachers at the school. Some not so nice to you.
Oh, some not so nice, but that's inevitable, isn't it?
Yeah, sure.
They probably, I mean, I write about them without much charity in the book, but they were probably entirely justified in the misgivings they had about me as an actor. But I really learnt the game not through the teachers, although there were some very admirable teachers at the school, but from my fellow students, and in particular an American who'd been a professional actor in New York and came to RADA with news of Kazan and The Method, and he'd seen Death of a Salesman, and he'd seen Streetcar and Julie Harris in Carson McCullers' play. And he was so much better than anybody in the school that I studied him. And I tried to, by observing him, I tried to see...
And yet he did not make it as an actor.
He didn't make it as an actor because he got disgusted with the business. And he was writing, at the same time he was writing...
What was his name?
His name was Jack Salamanca, and he was writing a book called The Lost Country during the time we were at RADA, which he then completed a couple of years later, and it was published to enormous acclaim. And then he decided to be a writer, and wrote a second book was called Lilith, which was made into a movie with Warren Beatty and Gene Seberg.
But you were watching him act, and yet you were sort of typecast as a kind of British aristocratic twit kind of an actor in these terrible plays that you wound up doing in rap. So your influences were the American style, all the excitement, the energy, and dynamism that was going on in America at the time. You know, Brando and Kazan and all this. And yet here you were getting out of school, and you have to play, you know, and holding teacups in nice, pleasant drawing rooms.
Well, this is the paradox of being Australia, because at that time, I think there is a strong Australian identity now. But in those days, we didn't know quite who we were. I mean, our judges wore wigs and they appealed to the House of Lords. My father was in a building called the British Medical Association building. I went to a school which was an imitation of an English public school. And there was all that side, the British side, and then we had, coming over the radio, Jack Benny. We had all the American movies, and So we were composing our identity, really, out of these two completely disparate elements. So when I went to England, I wasn't quite sure what I was. I mean, I think artistically I was far more drawn to the American theatre, but I was conditioned to be kind of English, and the Englishness that I fitted into was this absurd Englishness of very bad plays, light comedies about upper-class twits. And I could play these sort of parts. I despised the text, but I could play them.
But this is the life of the actor starting out. I mean, you've got to take the work, so you took all of these.
Yeah, had to take the work.
And also you were in some wonderful repertory companies doing some very, very good work.
Eventually,
Yes.
But for a while I was in these weekly reps, which were sort of...
Which I have a feeling when you directed, famously, Michael Frayn's play Noises Off, you must have reached back into the memory bag to pull...
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, the plays we were in, some of the titles were things like He Walks in Her Sleep and Almost a Honeymoon, in which I had to wear a bowler hat and swing a rolled umbrella. And they were dredged up from the 20s and the 30s. And,
yeah. But things change, though, when you are cast in production of Titus Andronicus with Laurence Olivier.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Your first impressions of this great man who'd loomed so large in your life, and now you were going to work with him.
Well, the stars of that period, the great stars of that period, were really occupied a unique position because they did movies, but they also did theatre at a time when theatre still had enormous prestige with the general public. And they kind of held sway in both areas. This was also true in America of people like Spencer Tracy, who would come to Broadway. And they, because, I mean, the curious thing about show business is that you're imprinted as a child or an adolescent with an idea of what theatre is. And you go into the theatre to be part of that. And by the time you're getting somewhere, the theatre has changed, and you can no longer do the thing that you really wanted to do, or be the thing that you wanted to do. But in those days, Olivier was a towering figure. I mean, he'd done extraordinary work in the classical theatre, the great Shakespearean parts, but he was also Heathcliff. He was also Henry V on film.
What was it like to watch him perform? I mean, what did you take from him? Did you ever figure out what his greatness was? How he came to it?
Well, he was a sort of master technician as a theatre actor, to the extent that he had this amazing voice and an amazing capacity physically to sort of fill an auditorium. I think there are actors just as good as Laurence Olivier, and there were in his day, but I have never seen a stage performer to match him. I mean, he could just take an audience by the scruff of the neck and lift it up and shake it. And he had, his performances were usually characterized by some moment or some scene that was just thrilling. And we all sit there with our jaws.
And in Titus Andronicus, what was the scene that you watch from the wings every night?
Well, there was a scene called the street scene, because Titus Andronicus is sort of wild, over-the-top melodrama, but characterized by some great poetry. And there is an amazing scene when Titus has a number of quite appalling things happen to him. His son is banished, his daughter is raped and has her hands cut off so she cannot name, or her tongue cut out, name her assailants. And then a son who is going to be killed, Titus is told that if he'll cut off his own hand, he'll save the lives of the sons. He does so, and then the sons are returned to him in wicker baskets.
Just their heads.
Just their heads, yes. So it's extreme and extremely improbable too. But it is redeemed by this poetry which likens Titus's condition to the sea. He has a speech where he says, "I am the sea, hark how her sighs do." I can't remember. And it was just mesmeric the way Olivier did that.
You have a gut-wrenching description of the night that Vivien Leigh was drunk.
Yes.
Doing that scene.
Yes, yes, I have.
Well, you were...
I think I'll save that.
All right, save that for the book.
Yes,
Poor Vivien Leigh.
Yes.
Poor Vivien. Well, poor Laurence Olivier, what she winds up doing to him on stage.
Now, I wanted to ask you, in this book, you are running along with your fascinating story of becoming an actor and then becoming a director. You also have the story of your personal life and your meeting your first wife and getting together with her, and at the same time systematically cheating on her. I mean, you describe yourself in a way that is not completely sympathetic. Why have you chosen to include that in the book?
Well, because I wanted to write a truthful book about the theatre. And the theatre is a difficult game. I mean, couples are often separated. They're off for 6 months in a repertory company or something, and their private lives are constantly interrupted. And so they're quite likely to fall into patterns which other people would disapprove of. But also, I think if you're vain enough to say, I'm going to write a book about myself, you have an obligation to try and be as honest about yourself as you possibly can. And also, what I was trying to do was not write a book which would end up in the ghetto of theatre publications, but which would say something about not only the theatre of my time, those days, but about the society of that time. And we were moving through the 50s to the 60s and to a more liberal sexual code. And I've just seen this film, Kinsey, which I think is really a very honest and brilliant attempt to come to grips with a world I knew, and the problems that people fall into when they espouse, shall we say, greater sexual liberation. It was necessary, but it's always dangerous. And I was simply trying to be frank about this and say, well, this is the person you're reading about.
Well, you do, and your first wife, Shirley, in the book seems to give you leeway. I mean, you have these conversations when you're off on the road. She says to you at some point, I know you're going to cheat, but just don't tell me. Yes, right. She's an enlightened figure of the times.
But she is an enlightened figure of the times, and that sort of came, I suppose, out of the Bloomsbury literary movement. But there were a lot of casualties, as there would be later, a lot of casualties in this sort of hunger for freedom. And maybe we've gone the other way now, and we realize that that is possibly not the way to go. Who knows? But I don't think that, I don't think that the person I describe is really so exceptional.
Oh, imagine, no, not?
I think most people, have very checkered lives in that department.
But they usually gloss it over.
Yeah.
And that's what's so interesting. You do not.
Well, I don't think one should do that.
Well, no, but you're describing, as you say, the life in the theater, which you did in a novel.
Yes, I did in a novel, yes.
Your first and only novel, right?
Yes, next season.
Right.
Which is possibly a good deal more explicit than the book, but it was about a fictional character. But I suppose if there's a name attached to the person, then it becomes, oops.
Yeah.
Now, another thing you don't gloss over, there are people who it's clear you don't like. People you've worked with long-term, or you don't really respect their work.
The one that jumps out, well, is, I don't know if you don't respect his work, but Peter Hall. Very young, slick, glib, out of Cambridge, directing you in
Midsummer Night's Dream.
Midsummer Night's Dream.
I mean, you don't pull your punches on some people whose work you have problems with.
I give I hope, a truthful picture of my response to him at that time, but it is a subjective picture, and he probably would have his own.
And what was that picture, if you can tell us? I mean, what was your impression of the young Peter? He was becoming very well known at this time. He was a sort of Sam Mendes, if you will, of his time.
That's right, absolutely, and did some splendid work. I mean, an important work like Waiting for Godot. But I had just worked with a great director, Tyrone Guthrie, who was also a man of extraordinary moral force and great generosity. And very unfairly, the next show I did in that season, I did All's Well That Ends Well with Guthrie, and the next show was by this thrusting, up-and-coming young guy. And it's absurd to expect from him the qualities that I got from Guthrie, but I did.
Right.
I did.
But what you
so that's what I report.
Right.
I'm not interested in slanging off Peter. He's done very well and done a lot of important work. But I am interested in charting the kind of ethical core that runs through good theatre, and the way people should be, the way you should behave to people, and the way what the theatre really should be about.
Well, what Guthrie did, and in some ways I suppose it began your true directing career, if you will. You had not a great big part in All's Well That Ends Well.
No.
But he gave you attention.
Yes, that's right.
And then he gave you the freedom to take some of his direction and play around with it and do something more.
That's right. And he gave me a vote of confidence.
Yeah.
And that, at that stage of my career, I was very, very grateful for.
And the contrast with Peter Hall was that you were not the star, and who was Charles Laughton in this particular version.
Right.
And Peter Hall had a kind of hierarchy of how he treated people.
Yes.
Here were the stars, and here were the others.
But also remember, we were contemporaries.
Yeah.
And therefore we took a different view of each other. And he was, if anything, slightly younger than I was, I think. So I was naturally extremely envious.
Well, there is envy in
Yeah,
running through this book, because a lot of people that you come up with go farther than you have. I mean, their careers take off before
Well, at least
yours
for the
took
time
off.
being, yeah.
Yeah, well, of course yours does take off. You
Yes.
become Michael Blakemore,
You become
celebrated
Michael
Tony
Blakemore.
Award-winning director. But is there that resentment, though, that envy as you see?
Well, there
people
wasn't
you knew?
resentment, but I mean, the theatre's very competitive,
Yeah.
and there are a lot of people fighting for scraps. And if you have a contemporary and they suddenly, hit the big time, and you're left looking at their name on a movie poster, you can do so certainly with generosity, but you can't help wondering what's going to happen to you.
Right.
So that's a condition of the theatre, I'm afraid. But I didn't. There was no resentment. There was occasional envy. But as I say about John Osborne, who I was in rep with, and then suddenly he became this, comet in the English theatre.
And he changed, though. Physically, you could see him change as he gets
that's
more.
right.
What happened?
Well, I don't know. I think it's we were all pale and desperate, and then John got this enormous acclaim, and I'd see him. I had a flat in the King's Road, and he had a flat further up, and I'd see him walking to the Royal Court every morning, and each morning he walked, he was a little bit straighter, cheeks a little bit pinker, a little bit more confident, a little bit more blasé if you ran into him. But we remained friends, and when I had some success as a director, he was very nice. We corresponded, and I liked him a lot.
Now, the book takes you up to the period where you did Joe Egg.
That's
with
right.
Which
Peter
was your
Nichols.
break.
Yeah,
Your break
Yes,
with
that's
Peter
right.
Nichols' play. Yeah.
Yes.
When you start to get that pink glow of success.
Yes, it's left me a bit now, but for a while I was pink.
Yeah, and how does that come about? I mean, what is the cause of this breakthrough that you finally have? I mean, because you're in your early 30s now, right?
No, I'm late 30s.
Late 30s now, yeah. So
yes.
you're a late sort of starter as a
Yes, I
major
was.
director.
But at the same time, during my career as an actor, which I found very frustrating, because I didn't think that temperamentally, I had some success, mainly in comic parts, but temperamentally I was not suited for an actor. I didn't have the sort of flexibility to sort of roll with the punches. During the time I was an actor, of course, I was writing my novel.
Right.
And then suddenly I had this amazing year when the novel was accepted for publication by Simon & Schuster. I got a job at the Glasgow Citizens Theatre as one of the artistic directors, and my friend Peter Nichols sent me this play that I had lived through with him, because we got married at the same time, about his disabled child, and nobody else would put it on. And rather reluctantly he sent it to me, and I said, yes, I'd love to put it on. And we put it on, and it was a great success. So I had three remarkable things happening to me. And I went with directing. I suppose if I hadn't been a director, I would have then started to write a bit more.
Well, the book ends, and I assume there's going to be a second part, because, I mean, we haven't gotten...
Well, that took me rather a long time to write. I don't think there's time to...
Oh, get on it.
Get on it?
Yes,
Yeah.
we want to know what
happened.
huge success is like. I want to know, as I read in Peter Nichols' diaries, how your house in Biarritz gets better and better and better.
Yes,
as
you
the
must
success
write
comes.
cartoons.
I'm sorry?
Well, I wrote this book because I think that actually success is quite pleasant to have, although not nearly as pleasant as you thought it was going to be.
That's a book, though.
That's a book. But I think it's very dull, because it's essentially treading water.
Yeah.
You know, you struggle, you get to a certain plateau where you get some good work, then you've got to stay there. But it's got no momentum. It's just, and it's, for the reader, it's boring, and it consists of dropping names and telling people about things that they don't have any direct experience of.
Right.
But I think that struggle is interesting,
Yes.
because it's in a period of struggle that you discover who you are, you discover what your abilities are, what you should be doing with your life, and so that's why I wrote that book.
Now, it's hunger that is the engine of this book.
Yes, exactly. And you don't have to be in the theatre
to understand that.
to understand that, no.
It's a terrific book, Michael Blakemore's Arguments with England. Not published over here yet, but I suspect you can pick it up in some drama bookstore. It is.
It is going to be published,
Oh,
yes.
very good.
Coming
hooray.
out in September by Faber Inc.
Thanks for being a guest. It's always a pleasure to have you here.
And a pleasure for me. Thank
Good to
you
see
both.
you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Brush up your Shakespeare. Start quoting him now. Brush up your Shakespeare, and the women you will wow. Just declaim a few lines from Otella, and they'll think you're a hell of a fella.
If your blonde don't respond when you flatter her, hello, what Tony Cleopatra.
If she fights when her clothes you are mussing,
What a clothes much ado about nothing. Brush up your Shakespeare,
and they'll all now.
Our thanks to the Friends of Theatre Talk for their significant contribution to this production. Theatre Talk is made possible in part by the Frederick Lowe Foundation, the Eleanor Naylor Dana Charitable Trust, the Alan S. Gordon Foundation, the Corey and Bob Donnelly Charitable Fund, Carrie J. Fries, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and the New York State Council on the Arts, a state agency.
Playbill Online is the official website of Theatre Talk and the home of the Playbill Club, providing information and opportunities for theatre lovers. We welcome your questions or comments for Theatre Talk. Thank you and good night.